Welcome back. Consider the particular genius of a revenge built not from confrontation, but from a copyright registration timestamp. The kind of move that costs nothing to execute and everything to defend against. That is the architecture of what we're examining today. The weapon was always paper. The war was always won before it was declared. Right here on Eternal Diary. The first thing Lena Cho noticed when she came back was the smell of cold coffee. Not the sharp, fresh ground scent of a morning that still had promise in it. This was the particular staleness of a cup left sitting on a nightstand for 2 hours, while its owner forgot to drink it. Flat, faintly sour, carrying that specific quality of neglect that only develops when someone is too absorbed in something else to care. The smell hit her before her eyes opened, before she understood anything. And before the architecture of what had happened to her clicked back into place like a construction site assembling itself at high speed, panel by panel, floor by floor, until the full terrible building was standing again in her chest. She lay very still. She was not dead. That was the first thing she confirmed, with the methodical calm of someone taking inventory after a disaster. She ran through the checklist quietly, as the way her composition teacher Raymond Holt had taught her to approach any problem. Not with panic, not with elation, but with clean-eyed assessment. Heartbeat, present, breathing, functioning. The weight of a mattress under her shoulders, real. The slight itch of a cotton pillowcase against her cheek, real. The smell of cold coffee, real and specific and deeply, impossibly familiar. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was the particular off-white of a room that had been painted once, years ago, with budget paint in a color called antique linen that had yellowed to something approximating cream. There was a water stain near the corner in the shape of something that, if you looked at it wrong, resembled the outline of the South Korean peninsula. She had spent 4 years staring at that water stain while she composed. She had composed 3 albums worth of material lying in this exact position, watching that stain, letting her mind drift until the melody came. She had not seen this ceiling in 7 years, because 7 years ago she had moved out of this apartment. She had taken her keyboard, her headphones, her notebooks dense with chord progressions and lyric fragments, and she had moved into a brighter, bigger space in a building with an elevator that actually worked, and natural light that came through south-facing windows. She had moved because she could afford to, because by then, as the first singles from the Architecture's EP had started generating real streaming numbers, and the licensing deal with that skincare campaign had paid out. And for the first time in her adult life, she was not calculating whether she could afford both groceries and sustenance for her equipment. She had not seen this ceiling in 7 years, because in the life she remembered, she was 31 years old. She was, she now understood with the kind of crystalline certainty that does not require confirmation, 24. Lena sat up slowly. Her body felt strange. Lighter in the specific way that youth feels light when you have already experienced its absence, when you have already felt your joints begin their negotiations with gravity, when you have already known what it means to wake up tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. This body was rested. This body was 24 and rested and had a full head of hair that she had let grow to her shoulders and had not yet cut into the asymmetrical bob she'd adopted at 26. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the room. The keyboard was there, against the wall, covered with a piece of fabric she'd repurposed from a curtain because she couldn't afford a proper cover. The notebooks were stacked on the desk in their familiar towers. The blue ones for melodic ideas. The black ones for lyrics, the red ones for what she called technical dreams, which was her private term for the compositions she knew she wasn't yet skilled enough to execute. On the nightstand, the cold coffee. Her phone, face down. A dog-eared copy of a book on music copyright law that she had been working through slowly that winter. That book. She reached for it without thinking, picked it up, felt the specific bend of the spine at the pages she had dog-eared. She had been reading it because Raymond had told her to. "You don't understand your own value," he'd said, in that measured way he had of making observations that felt like scalpels. "You think about the music. You need to also think about the container for the music. The law is the container. Learn to love the container." She had been 24 and dismissive. She had thought Raymond was being a worrying old man. She had thought the important thing was the sound, the composition, the architecture of a piece, not the paperwork. She placed the book back on the nightstand with something that felt from the outside like gentleness, and was, from the inside, more like a decision being made. In the life she remembered, she had not learned to love the container. She had trusted instead. She had trusted Vivienne Park with everything, with her compositions, with her creative process, Atu with the access codes to her cloud storage, and the login for her digital audio workstation backup. She had trusted Vivienne with the full body of work she'd spent 3 years building, because Vivienne was her best friend, because Vivienne had a way of making you feel that your trust was the most natural thing in the world to extend, because Vivienne had large, warm eyes and a laugh that made you feel chosen, and because Lena, at 24, had not yet understood that the feeling of being chosen was a very particular kind of bait. She had found out on a Tuesday, 2 years later. She had been in a coffee shop, not the expensive kind, just a place near her studio that made adequate Americanos and had outlets near the tables, when a song came through the speaker system overhead that stopped her mid-sip. She knew the chord progression the way she knew her own pulse rate. She knew the particular resolution in the bridge, the way the melody dropped a minor third before climbing back. She knew it because she had built it at 3 in the morning in the apartment with the off-white ceiling, with the keyboard under the repurposed curtain cover, with cold coffee going stale on the nightstand beside her. The song was credited to Vivienne Park. By that point, Vivienne had been signed for 18 months to Carver Strand Records, one of the mid-major labels with a reputation for discovering what their marketing department called sophisticated alternative pop. Vivienne had released 2 singles. Both of them had performed modestly. Then she had released a full EP called Cartography, and it had done something the 2 singles hadn't. It had connected. Music journalists used words like architectural and emotionally precise. One reviewer wrote that Vivienne's compositions had the quality of music that exists before it's written, as if it was always there and the artist simply had the gift to find it. Lena had read that review the morning it was published and felt something she could not yet name sitting under her sternum. She had named it later. Standing in the coffee shop, all listening to the chord progression she had built at 3 in the morning, she had named it precisely. She had not confronted Vivienne immediately. That had been, she understood now, her first mistake in a series of mistakes that each compounded the last. She had gone home instead. She had listened to the full EP. She had sat with her notebooks open, matching melodic phrases to the fragments she had written in those blue notebooks, finding them like bodies in shallow water, not exactly hidden, just not where they were supposed to be, relocated without ceremony or acknowledgement. 12 compositions. The full Cartography EP was 12 compositions that were, in their essential DNA, hers. She had made the second mistake shortly after. She had called Raymond, who had introduced her to Vivienne 4 years earlier. Raymond, who thought of Vivienne as a kind of daughter, who had mentored them both simultaneously, and who had, Lena had come to understand this only much later, genuinely not known. Raymond had loved Vivienne's music with the uncritical warmth of a man who did not have access to the original source material, who had never seen the notebooks, who had simply heard the finished product and been moved by it. When Lena told him, Raymond had gone quiet for a long time. Then he had said, in a voice that was careful and terrible, "Do you have documentation?" She didn't. That was the answer. And that was the architectural failure that the entire structure of her first life had been built upon. She had the notebooks, but notebooks without timestamps, without digital metadata, without the kind of formal registration that turns creative work into property. She had the files on her hard drive, but the file creation dates had been duplicated when she'd transferred them. A technical accident that a moderately skilled attorney could turn into reasonable doubt. She had the memory of creation, and she had the music itself, and she had nothing else. Vivienne's label had a legal team. Lena had a music copyright book she had not yet finished reading. The case, such as it was, had not gone well. There was no formal lawsuit. She couldn't afford one, and the evidence wasn't clean enough. There was a meeting, arranged through Raymond, at which Vivienne had appeared with 2 lawyers and a calm that Lena would spend years trying to understand the mechanism of. Had it been practiced? Was it pharmaceutical? Was it simply what you looked like when you had already decided that someone else's reality was irrelevant to your own? Vivian had said, with great composure, that Lena was confused, that she had been generous with her musical ideas over the years, in the organic way that collaborators share ideas, and that it was understandable, in retrospect, that Lena felt some sense of ownership over the sounds that had passed between them. Oh, but ownership and authorship were different things. Vivian had composed cartography. If there were similarities to things Lena had played for her privately, that was the natural cross-pollination of two artists who had spent time in each other's creative orbit. She had delivered this explanation with the warmth of someone explaining a minor misunderstanding about a restaurant reservation. Raymond had, in the end, believed her. Or chosen to believe her. Lena had never been fully certain which one it was. He had stepped back from mentoring Lena with a gentleness that was worse, somehow, than outright abandonment. He had framed it as giving her space to grow independently. He had never stopped being cordial. He had simply stopped being available, and in his unavailability had taken with him the primary professional connection through which Lena had access to the industry relationships that her career required. Without Raymond, without the compositions she could not claim, without the early adopter industry buzz that Vivian had absorbed by attaching Lena's musical identity to her own public persona, Lena's career had not collapsed so much as deflated. Slowly. The way a tire goes flat when the puncture is small. You don't notice until you're already struggling. At 26, she had cut her hair into an asymmetrical bob and taken a job scoring corporate training videos. At 28, she had moved into a studio apartment with a window that faced a parking structure. At 31, she had been walking across an intersection when a delivery vehicle running a red light had turned what would have been a routine Tuesday into the last moment of her first life. She did not remember the impact. She remembered the sound of it. A high, flat note, like a key struck once on a piano that had not been tuned in years. And then the smell of the cold coffee. Oh, the smell of the cold coffee and the off-white ceiling and the water stain shaped like a peninsula, and the music copyright book she had not yet finished reading. Lena set both feet on the floor. The wood was cold. She had not bought a rug for this apartment because rugs had seemed like an unnecessary expense. She noted the cold and did not move to get socks. She sat for a moment with the cold floor under her feet and considered, with the steadiness of someone who has already absorbed the worst and is now, simply, deciding what to do next, the full scope of what she had been given. She was 24 years old, she had 7 years of advanced knowledge, she had the music copyright book, and this time she was going to finish it. And she had, in the precise architecture of her memory, every composition she had written between the ages of 21 and 31, including the ones she had written after cartography. After the deflation, after the parking structure window, the ones that no one had heard, the ones she had kept writing even when there was no career infrastructure to receive them, because the music did not stop coming when the career did, because that was not how music worked, because Lena Cho composed the way other people breathed. Not as a choice, but as a biological function. She stood up. She picked up the music copyright book. She sat back down at the desk and opened it to page 1. She was not going to start in the middle this time. The law, as it turned out, was not actually difficult to understand. This was one of the things Lena had told herself in her first life as a reason not to read carefully. It was too dense, too technical, too far from the intuitive space where her real work happened. She had constructed a story about herself as someone who dealt in the immaterial and found the material alien. She had used this story as a reason not to learn the things she needed to know. She read the book in 3 days. Then she ordered 2 more. She read those. Then she began reading case law, which was available online in searchable databases that she had previously not thought to access. She read about the distinction between musical composition copyright and sound recording copyright, the way a song could be owned at 2 different layers. Thus, the sheet music and the recording being legally separate objects that could be held by entirely different parties. She read about the registration requirements, and more importantly, the timing requirements, and the way that pre-registration could function as a kind of timestamp, a formal declaration of existence lodged with the Copyright Office that carried the legal weight of a birth certificate for creative work. She understood, reading this for the first time, why Raymond had told her to love the container. The container was the only thing that held up in court. The container was the only thing that another person couldn't simply pick up and carry away with them. She began registering her work the following week, not in batches, in individual filings, each composition treated as its own protected entity, with dates and documentation and the kind of careful record-keeping that made the digital metadata on her files clean and unambiguous. She registered the compositions as musical works before recording them, which meant the copyright existed at the compositional level, prior to any recorded expression. She built a paper trail with the meticulous patience of someone constructing a foundation that would need to bear serious weight. She also, for the first time, opened a proper publishing entity. This was the part of the music business that she had understood only in the abstract in her first life. And she had known that publishing rights and master rights were different things, had known this the way you know facts that you have not yet needed to apply. In the life she remembered, she had never thought about it because she had never needed to. Her career had been derailed before she reached the stage where publishing became relevant. But she was reading now with the attention of someone who had seen the damage that ignorance could do, and she understood that a publishing company, even a small one-person entity, gave her a formal ownership stake in her compositions that was distinct from the recordings, and that would survive any future complications with labels or collaborators or people who looked at your work and decided it belonged to them. She named it Tungsten Music, after the element, high melting point, extremely dense, resistant to deformation under stress. The formation cost her $412. Seeds. All of which she paid with money she had been saving for a new microphone. She would find another way to get the microphone. She also changed the password on her cloud storage, and her DAW backup, and her email. She did this without ceremony, the same way she changed the locks. Vivienne Park came back into her life on a Thursday in April, approximately 6 weeks after Lena had woken up on the floor of her own past. And she arrived at the coffee shop where they used to meet, a place with exposed brick and rotating local art on the walls, and a barista named Jerome who knew their orders, carrying a tote bag printed with the logo of an arts organization and wearing a gray cardigan that she had paired with wide-leg trousers in a way that managed to look both effortless and considered. Vivienne had always dressed this way. She moved through the world as if the world had been designed around her comfort. And the remarkable thing about it was that it worked. People responded to her as if it were true. Lena watched her come through the door and felt nothing that resembled the clenching, disorienting grief she had felt standing in the coffee shop 7 years from now, listening to her chord progressions played through a ceiling speaker. She felt instead a very specific clarity, the kind that comes when you have already grieved something fully and arrived on the other side. She felt, and if she was honest with herself, interested. "You look different," Vivienne said, sliding into the chair across from her. She studied Lena with the attentive, slightly narrowed gaze that she used when evaluating something. Not malicious, just assessing. "Did you do something with your hair?" "Nothing," Lena said. "You seem more settled, something in the eyes." Vivienne tilted her head. "Are you sleeping?" "I'm sleeping fine." Vivienne smiled, accepted her coffee from Jerome. Howard wrapped both hands around the cup. She had beautiful hands, long-fingered and steady. Piano hands, Raymond called them, though Vivienne had only taken 3 years of formal piano training and relied mainly on instinct. Which was fine, as instincts went. Vivienne's instincts were genuinely good. This was the thing Lena had spent years trying to reconcile in her first life, the fact that Vivienne was talented. Not in the compositional way that Lena was talented, not in the architectural, 12 layers deep way where a melody was a structure you lived inside. But if Vivienne had an ear, and she had presence, and she had the specific quality of performance that made people feel something without being able to say exactly what Vivienne had lacked in her first life was enough material of her own. And so she had used Lena's. Lena watched her drink her coffee and thought, "I know what you are. I know what you'll do. I know the exact sequence of it. And I am going to let you try." "Oh, how's the new EP going?" Vivienne asked. "The one you were telling me about. What did you call it? The harmonic architecture project?" "Coming along," Lena said. "Can I hear anything?" "Not yet." Vivienne looked at her over the rim of her cup. The look was brief and legible only if you knew what to look for. A quick recalibration, the slight adjustment of a person who was used to being given access and had encountered, for once, a door that didn't immediately open. "Oh, you're more protective of it this time." "I'm always protective of my work," Lena said. "I'm just better at expressing it now." This was technically a lie. In the chronological sense, Lena had not been better at expressing it before. She had, in fact, been constitutionally bad at guarding her process, had been the kind of person who played unfinished work for people because she loved the music and wanted it to be heard, also because she confused the intimacy of sharing creative work with emotional closeness, because she had not yet understood that intimacy and proximity were two very different things. She understood now. "Fair enough," Vivian said and smiled. The smile was warm and entirely genuine looking and did not reach whatever part of her was actually keeping score. "Raymond says you're working on something more experimental. He seemed excited about it." "Did he?" "He adores you." "Oh, do you know that?" Lena looked at the watermark on the side of her coffee cup, a half-circle ring from a previous beverage. "I know," she said. Raymond, in this timeline, was still fully present, still holding space in her professional life. She had kept their Tuesday afternoon sessions without interruption and had shown him the registered compositions in a way she framed as starting to take the business side more seriously. And Raymond had looked at the registration certificates with an expression of quiet satisfaction that she understood now as relief. The relief of a teacher who has watched a student absorb a lesson they'd been trying to teach for years. She had not told him what she knew about Vivian. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in those terms. That the information was not a weapon she needed to use externally. It was simply architecture, the load-bearing knowledge underneath everything she was building. "How's your writing going?" Lena asked Vivian, because it was the natural question, because she was curious in a clinical way about whether, absent access to Lena's work, Vivian's output would slow or stop or transform into something else entirely. Vivian made a small, expressive movement with her free hand. Not quite a shrug, more like a ripple. "It's been harder lately. I don't know. The sounds I'm finding feel a little hollow, like I'm writing around something instead of inside it." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "It does," Lena said, and meant it. Writing around something instead of inside it. It was, she thought, a more accurate description of Vivian's situation than Vivian herself realized. I meant when you built your compositional language out of borrowed architecture, when the structures you worked in weren't ones you had designed yourself, the spaces inside them didn't fit. You moved through them at angles. Things echoed strangely. She had described Lena's work as hollow, but what she was actually describing was the hollowness of inhabiting a form that hadn't been built around your specific body. "What are you listening to lately?" Vivian asked. "A lot of early Arvo Part," Lena said. And some Hazel Scott, and this composer named Midori Takada. Not current stuff, not much. I find it distracting when I'm deep in something." Vivian nodded slowly, filing this away. Lena watched the filing happen. It was almost mechanical once you knew to look for it. The way Vivian collected information about her influences, the sonic spaces she was working in, the emotional register of her current project. In her first life, Lena had read this collection as interest, as the natural curiosity of one artist in another. She finished her coffee. She paid for both cups, which she always did, which Vivian always accepted without the performance of protest that some people offered. She said goodbye with warmth that was real because she could afford it, because the warmth didn't cost her anything now, because she was holding everything that mattered somewhere Vivian couldn't reach. Walking home through the April air, cold enough to still carry a bite at the edges, Lena made a mental list of what she needed to do that month. Register 3 more compositions with the Copyright Office. Complete the formation of Tungsten Music's publishing entity structure. Read the chapter on compulsory licensing she had been putting off because it was dry even by copyright law standards. Contact the professor at the music law clinic at the university about their consulting drop-in hours, which were open to independent artists and cost nothing. Begin the long-term work on the EP she thought of internally as the unreachable one. The compositions she had written in her first life in the years of diminishment, the ones no one had heard, the ones she had been certain for years, were too strange. too structural, too deliberately uninhabitable to find an audience. She had thought, for years, that these compositions were her consolation prize. Still, the things she made when no one was watching. She understood now that they were the asset. She turned the corner onto her street, hands in her jacket pockets, already hearing the opening movement of the first track in the space behind her eyes, the specific frequency of that minor seventh that announced the whole harmonic language of what she was going to build. She did not feel angry. She had done her anger somewhere in the first week, alone in the apartment. So was during the hours when she'd sat at the keyboard and played through everything she remembered losing and let herself feel the full dimensions of what had been taken. She had been thorough about it. Grief that is not fully entered becomes an infection that leaks. She had entered it fully and come out the other side. What she felt now was more like a builder feels at the beginning of a significant project. The weight of all that is to be done. And underneath the weight, holding it up, the quiet pleasure of knowing exactly how. The EP took her 8 months to record, which was longer than she had ever taken, and shorter than it would have taken if she had not already, in her previous life, written most of it. The complication was translation. Remembering a composition and reconstructing it were related but not identical processes. She had to go back through the compositions not as memories but as problems. Sit with each one, disassemble it, and understand why each element was where it was. Find the logic underneath the feeling. It was, in a strange way, more intimate than the original writing had been. The original writing had been intuitive, emerging from the particular grief and quiet of those diminished years. The reconstruction required her to understand, intellectually, what the grief had built. She worked in her apartment on the keyboard under the repurposed curtain cover. Then she recorded everything into a second-hand interface that she had bought from a musician who was moving and needed fast cash. And she took the recordings to Raymond's studio twice to work on specific arrangements that needed more than the keyboard could give. She had a small budget saved from the corporate scoring work she did on the side. She had kept the corporate scoring work in this life because she understood now that having a financial floor was not a compromise. She was not evidence of artistic failure, was simply the material infrastructure of a life in which the real work could continue. Raymond listened to the first 3 tracks without speaking. He sat at his mixing board with his hands folded and his head slightly forward, in the posture of a man genuinely listening, not performing listening. When she played the 3rd track through and the final tone dissolved into silence, he sat for another full minute before he said anything. Where did this come from?" he said. It was not a question. "I've been sitting on these ideas for a while," Lena said, "letting them breathe before I built them out." He turned to look at her. Raymond was 63, with a face that had been carefully carved by decades of honest attention to other people's work. And he had the kind of eyes that saw through performance without making the performance feel embarrassing. "This is not a preliminary direction," he said. "This is a complete language. You were this specific before, but not this sure of yourself." I got clearer. "It happens. Usually takes more time." He looked back at the board. "Who's heard this?" "No one." "Keep it that way until it's finished. This level of originality invites theft before it invites celebration." The word theft landed in the air between them with its own specific gravity. Raymond, who did not know what he was saying, who was issuing the warning 7 years late in one timeline and exactly on time in another. Lena looked at the back of his head and felt something that was not quite affection and not quite grief and was somewhere in the overlapping space between the two. "I know," she said. "I've been careful." She completed the EP over the next 4 months, including 2 sessions with a string trio she hired through the music school, and one very particular afternoon spent persuading a pianist she'd met through the music law clinic, a man named Ellis who primarily played session work and had perfect pitch and the specific quality of patience that technical perfection sometimes produces, to play the bridge section of the 4th track in the specific way she heard it, which was slightly ahead of the natural pulse, like someone walking faster than they meant to. Ellis had gotten it on the 3rd take. He had looked at her afterward with the expression of a musician who has just played someone else's vision perfectly and is surprised by how much it feels like their own. She registered every session recording with the Copyright Office as it was completed. She registered every musical composition, individually and as a collection. She documented the recording dates with timestamps, the session logs, the correspondence with the musicians. She saved contracts. She kept a master document that she backed up in 3 locations, including a cloud storage account that used 2-factor authentication and a password that was 32 characters long and stored nowhere except her memory. She did not play any of it for Vivian. Vivian, over those 8 months, had begun to feel the friction, not consciously, or perhaps consciously but without being able to name the source. She called more often, and she asked to meet for coffee and then for lunch, and then for studio visits that Lena declined pleasantly and firmly. Lana could see the shape of what was happening. Vivian was in the preparation stage for her sophomore record, and she was finding that the compositional approach she had used for cartography was not yielding the same results when she attempted to apply it to new material. The architecture didn't replicate well without the original architect. They had dinner once, and in the 5th month, at a restaurant Vivian chose that had low lighting and a menu that required decisions. Vivian was 4 glasses of wine in before she said, with a careful carelessness that was its own kind of tell, "I've been thinking about the idea of formal collaboration, like credited. Have you ever thought about that? The way some composer duos work, where both names are on the work?" Lena cut a small piece from her plate, brought it to her mouth, chewed, swallowed. Externally, composed, internally, running the architecture of this offer through every assessment she had. "I think collaboration is interesting when both people are contributing distinct things," she said. "What would you bring to a formal collaboration?" Vivian's smile held. It was a skilled smile. "Access. Network. Raymond's been introducing me around. And honestly, my performance sensibility, you're extraordinary at structure. But structure needs a face. Structure needs a face." Asante, the phrasing was so cleanly honest about the intended transaction that Lena had to restrain something that was not quite admiration. "I'd want to understand the ownership structure clearly before any conversation like that goes further," Lena said. "Publishing splits, master ownership, songwriting credits, the whole container." There it was again. The brief, almost invisible recalibration. The slight adjustment of the door-finding closed scenario. "Of course," Vivian said. "Naturally. Now that's just standard." "Yes," Lena said. "It is." They finished dinner talking about other things. Vivian did not raise formal collaboration again that evening. Lena paid for her half of the bill. The EP was finished in November. She called it Low Frequency Architecture, which was a title that said exactly what it meant. These were compositions built from the bottom up, from bass frequencies and low harmonics and the structural elements of sound that you felt more than heard. The cover was a photograph she had taken herself through the window of the apartment of the parking structure across the street at 4 a.m, when the fluorescent lights had a blue quality that turned the concrete into something almost beautiful. She sent it to Raymond before anyone else. He called her the morning after he had first listened to it. She picked up after 1 ring, already at her desk, already with coffee that she was actually drinking. "Oh, you understand, this is a significant piece of work," he said, without greeting. "I hoped so. I'm going to call Maren." Maren Ostergaard, Swedish music journalist, longtime contributor to the publication that had been, since before Lena was born, the most respected voice in the independent music space. She had an ear for structural work that most of her contemporaries didn't, and a willingness to champion music that wasn't immediately accessible, that required the listener to live inside it before they could articulate why it worked. Raymond had been trying to get her attention for other artists over the years, with limited success. Maren was interested in exactly what she was interested in, and nothing adjacent to it. "She'll take time," Lena said. "She will, but when she does, it counts." "I know." "I'm also going to send it to Devin." Devin Strand, the co-founder of Carver Strand Records, the person who had, in her first life, signed Vivian Park. In her first life, Devin Strand had heard 1 track of Lena's demo through Raymond 3 years before cartography. He had passed. He had said, through Raymond, that the compositions were interesting but abstract, that they required a performer's voice to ground them, that he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with music that didn't have a clear seat in any existing market. He had not been wrong, exactly. He had simply been early. "He passed on my demo 2 years ago," Lena said. He made a mistake. He knows he makes mistakes. Devon's best quality is that he admits them. Raymond paused. He's been watching the independent space more carefully lately. He let something slip, a signing he passed on that he's spent the last year thinking about. He's in a particular state of mind that is receptive to being given a second chance to get something right. Lena took a long drink of her coffee. Outside, but the November light was doing something beautiful to the side of the building across the street, that particular bronze it achieved in late afternoon when the sun was low. "Okay," she said. "Send it to him. I'll also send it to the sync licensing team at Threshold." Raymond added, "They've been looking for something with this kind of density for a project that keeps coming up in conversation. I'll say more when I know more." After she hung up, Lena sat for a moment in the specific quiet of a project that has been released from her hands into the worlds. It was a feeling she remembered from her first life, always followed by anxiety, the loss of control, the exposure, the waiting. This time, the anxiety was not absent, but it was sitting inside a larger structure that held it steady. She had done everything correctly. The compositions were registered. The entity was formed. And the documentation was complete and accessible and multiply backed up. The container was, this time, built before the music went into it. Whatever happened next would happen to something that was formally, legally, irrevocably hers. Devon Strand took 6 weeks to call. He reached her directly, not through Raymond, which she took as a sign. Raymond had given him the number, but the call itself was Devon's choice. And the choice to reach out directly, rather than through an intermediary, meant he was already thinking about this as a relationship rather than a transaction. Devon Strand, 52 years old, with the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made, called her on a Thursday morning while she was eating toast and reading a case study on the Marvin Gaye estate litigation that she kept in a folder on her desktop labeled Reference. "I made a mistake," he said. Without preamble. 2 years ago. I want to correct it." "What kind of correction?" she asked, because she had learned in her reading that the shape of an offer mattered as much as its content, and that the shape was often revealed in how the offering party defined the problem they were solving. "I want to sign low-frequency architecture to Carver Strand, and I want to talk about a long-term relationship, not just this record." She did not say yes immediately, though she had already built the structure of what she would require before she did. She said, "I'd like to talk about the specific terms of the deal." "Of course." "Publishing, specifically. I have a publishing entity formed. I'll want to retain publishing on the compositions." There was a brief pause, a pause she recognized as Devon recalibrating, the slight adjustment of someone who had expected the conversation to move faster. In her first life, the move would have been to yield here, or to treat the retention of publishing as a bargaining chip to be traded for something else, to be grateful for the offer and not press the container. She had learned, from her reading and from everything she had lived, that publishing was not a bargaining chip. Publishing was the house. You did not trade the house for the furniture. "That's not our standard arrangement," Devon said. "I know what your standard arrangement is," Lena said. Which was true. She had read the contract that Vivian's attorneys had summarized in the entertainment law blog post that had been used as a case study in a class at the university, published when Carver Strand's deal structure became briefly newsworthy. "I'm not asking for standard. I'm asking for what my work requires." Another pause. Then, with what sounded like genuine amusement, Raymond said you'd gotten clearer. "Raymond is accurate. Let me have our business affairs team look at the structure of your publishing entity. If it's set up correctly..." "It is," she said. "Then there's a version of this arrangement that works for both of us." She agreed to a follow-up call with the business affairs team the following week. She contacted the music law clinic at the university that afternoon and arranged to review the developing contract terms with the consulting attorney there, a woman named Dr. Felicia Osei, who had spent 8 years in entertainment law before moving to academia, and who had the specific quality, rare in advisors, of explaining what a clause meant both legally and practically. Not just what the contract said, but what it was trying to do. So she spent the next 10 days learning more about publishing deal structures than most artists learn in a career. Vivian found out about the Devon Strand deal from Raymond. This was not something Lena had arranged. Raymond told Vivian the way he told anyone about the developments of people he cared about, with genuine happiness, as news worth sharing. He had told Vivian because he thought Vivian would be happy for Lena. He had perhaps also told her because he did not yet understand, and would never fully understand, the weight-bearing relationship between these two women's careers. Vivian texted Lena the afternoon Raymond told her, "That's incredible news. Devin is brilliant. You deserve this." Lena read the message and noted its specific construction. Not congratulations, which would position Lena as having achieved something. Not, "I'm so happy for you," which would be warm and unambiguous. "You deserve this," which sounded like an endorsement, but was also, structurally, a reassertion of the person doing the endorsing as the one with the authority to bestow deserving. She replied, "Thank you." She meant it, in the only way it was possible to mean it, as an acknowledgement of receipt. She saw Vivian 3 weeks later at a small gathering that Raymond hosted periodically at his studio, which functioned as a kind of salon. There were 12 people there, but mostly musicians, and one music journalist who worked for a smaller publication and was sharply observant in a way that didn't announce itself. Vivian arrived late, in a deep green dress that was one of the most beautiful things Lena had ever seen on another person. This was simply true, and Lena noted it without complication because she was not interested in the performance of not noticing beautiful things. Vivian was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. Almost the beauty was not relevant to any other assessment Lena was making. They were civil, warmly so, in the way of two people who have a shared history and have not, formally, fractured it. Vivian asked thoughtful questions about the record. Lena answered them at the level of the question, not expansively, not evasively, simply at the level of what was asked. At one point, near the end of the evening, almost when most of the guests had gathered around Raymond and his stories about a recording session in the 1990s, that had apparently devolved into a theological argument about the nature of silence in music, Vivian materialized beside Lena at the window. "The track he played earlier," Vivian said, meaning the one Raymond had put on the studio speakers mid-evening, the fourth track from Low Frequency Architecture, the one with Ellis's slightly ahead of pulse piano bridge. "Samat, the harmonic language in the third movement. Where does that come from?" "From me," Lena said. Vivian turned to look at her. In the window's reflection, they were both visible. Vivian in green, Lena in a deep charcoal that she had borrowed from her memory of a later time in her first life, when she had started to dress differently, after Raymond stepped back, after the styling had been one of the few things she still had control over. She liked charcoal, one that it made her feel like the absence of color, which had its own kind of presence. "I know that," Vivian said. "I meant, what tradition does it come from? What are you drawing on?" "I'm drawing on myself," Lena said. "That's the tradition I'm working in." The silence between them had a particular texture. Vivian studied her reflection for a moment, and Lena watched her study it. And in that watching, there was something that was not cruelty and not satisfaction either. But simply the feeling of a person who has understood, with full clarity, where they are standing. "You've changed," Vivian said. "I've clarified," Lena said. Raymond called them both over before Vivian could respond to that. They joined the group, and the evening continued. And it was pleasant in the way evenings are pleasant when the people in them are making an effort. And Lena drank sparkling water and listened to Raymond's story about the 1990s recording session and laughed in the right places and, underneath the evening, ran the quiet numbers of everything she had built. Maren Ostergaard published the review of Low Frequency Architecture 4 months after Devin Strand signed it, 3 weeks after the record's formal release. The review was 800 words long, which for the publication in question was substantial. Most reviews ran between 300 and 500 words, and the extended length was its own communication, a signal of the importance the publication was assigning to the work. Lena read it on the morning it published, at her kitchen table, with a coffee that was still hot. The review began, "There is a category of music that does not meet you where you are. It makes you come to it." She read it through twice, carefully. All Maren wrote with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years learning to describe the indescribable. And the review was not hyperbolic. It was, if anything, more accurate than effusive, which made it more useful. Maren wrote about the structural logic of the harmonic language, the way the compositions built internal worlds rather than external spaces. She wrote about the fourth track in particular, Ellis's bridge, entered the slightly ahead of pulse piano, as an example of what she called calibrated human error as compositional element, meaning that the choice was not actually an error, but the deliberate inclusion of the kind of imprecision that distinguishes a living performance from a produced one. She wrote, "Low-frequency architecture does something rare. It makes the listener aware of their own listening. You do not hear this music passively. The music notices you back." And at the end, the composer and artist Lena Cho has created, with this record, a system. Not a sound, not a genre, not a mood board. A full, internally consistent musical system, with its own logic and its own rules and its own gravitational field. The world will take time to learn how to move inside it. That will be worth the effort. Lena read it through for the third time, then set her phone face down on the table. She sat with the particular quality of that moment. The review was being shared already. She could feel it without looking, could predict the ripple pattern the way she could predict a melody's resolution. Raymond would have already seen it and would be calling within the hour. Devon's team would be sending the link around. The Music Law Clinic's Dr. Osei would probably forward it without comment. Will Ellis would send a one-word message that would be something like, "Whoa." What she was sitting with, underneath the practical predictability of all that, was something smaller and less articulable. The quiet sensation of being seen accurately, not praised. She had received praise before for work that was easier, for work that went down smoothly. This was different. This was the experience of having built something that communicated precisely what you meant it to communicate, and having that communication received. Raymond called in 40 minutes. He said, "Marin hasn't written 800 words about anything in 18 months. He said it in a tone that was satisfaction and pride and something that was almost relief. The relief of a teacher who has watched a student finally arrive somewhere they always believed the student was heading. Devon's team sent a 3-sentence email about recalibrating the promotional strategy in response to early critical response, which meant they were going to spend more on it. Ellis sent, "Whoa, what happened with Vivian happened in stages. The way structural failures in buildings happen, not all at once, but through a series of smaller events, each of which was containable on its own and devastating in accumulation. The first stage, Vivian's sophomore record, which she had been working on since the year before Lena's release, stalled. The stalling was not public, was not discussed. It was the industry internal knowledge that circulates through conversation and inference, the awareness that a follow-up to cartography had been expected at a certain point and had not materialized. Vivian put out a single that performed adequately. She put out another single 6 months later that performed less adequately. With it, the conversation around the singles was polite and slightly puzzled in the way that critical conversation becomes when an artist is perceived to be retreating from a promise they once seemed to be making. The second stage, Lena's record began to accumulate the kind of attention that changes the dimensions of a room. Not commercial success, not immediately. Low-frequency architecture was not music that went viral, that reached through speakers and coffee shops and grabbed people by the collar. It was music that found its people carefully, with the precision of something that knows exactly who it is for. The people it found tended to be the kind of people who talked about it, other musicians, composers, people who thought and wrote about sound. The critical conversation around it had a peculiar intensity, the quality of something that was being recognized as significant before it was widely known. The third stage was the sync licensing placement that Raymond had mentioned months earlier. Threshold placed 2 tracks from low-frequency architecture in a film. A quiet, slow, European co-production that found an audience at festivals before finding a distribution deal. The kind of film that was seen by relatively few people and discussed by many more. The licensing fees were not enormous, but they were real, and they came to Tungsten Music, to Lena's publishing entity, cleanly and with full documentation, because everything was registered and the container was airtight. The fourth stage was Devon Strand. Devon called her in the spring of the year following the record's release, approximately 18 months into their relationship, and asked her to come into the office to discuss what he described as a longer conversation. She went in on a Thursday, wearing a coat that was too light for the weather because she had not checked the forecast, and sat across from Devon in his office, which was on the 4th floor, and had a window that looked over a street where she could see, from her chair, A woman walking a very small dog that appeared to have opinions about where it was and was not willing to go. Devin said, "I want to talk about Vivian Park." She waited. "Her contract is up for renewal in 8 months," Devin said. "The second record hasn't come together the way any of us hoped. Oh, and there's a financial conversation that needs to happen. Advances, recoupment, the whole structure." He folded his hands on the desk. "I'm telling you this because I think it's relevant to you, and I think you're owed the honesty given the history." The history. He meant the history he knew. The overlap of Raymond's mentorship, the general awareness in the small world of independent music that these two women had been once close. He did not mean the other history. "Why is it relevant to me?" she asked. "Because there's a conversation being had," Devin said carefully, "about whether Vivian's compositional direction on the work she's been developing is, I'll put this precisely, derivative of a sound that now has a clearer and more compelling originator." The room was quiet. The street outside continued its business. The small dog had, apparently, won whatever territorial negotiation it had been conducting. "I see," Lena said. "Oh, I'm not asking you to do anything," Devin said. "I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your business." She thought about what she was going to say for exactly the length of time it took the woman on the street to coax the small dog past its objections. Then she said, "Is there a specific incident, or is this a general assessment?" Devin studied her. He was a perceptive man, which she had always understood, and he was in this moment being more careful than he usually was. Which meant he had already thought through the various shapes this conversation could take. "There's a demo track that Vivian's team shared with us last month, for consideration for the second record." He opened a folder, took out a single printed page, pushed it across the desk. "I'd like you to listen to it, and I'd like your honest assessment." She took the page. It was a one-line track description and a URL. She listened to the demo that afternoon on headphones, awing in the Carver Strand listening room, which was a small carpeted space off the main office floor where they evaluated recordings. It was a small room with 2 chairs and a shelf of reference recordings and a large pair of studio monitors that cost more than Lena's first 6 months of rent in the apartment with the off-white ceiling. She put the headphones on and pressed play and listened to 43 seconds of music before she stopped it. She sat in the listening room for a moment. Then she pressed play again and listened to the full 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The composition was using her harmonic language. Not identically. Vivian was not stupid, had not made the mistake of direct transposition. But the architecture was unmistakable, the specific logic of the low-frequency development, the way the harmonic movement resolved by going further down rather than up, the structural principle that she had spent years building into a complete system. It was and she thought, like seeing a building that had been copied without access to the blueprints. The proportions were slightly wrong, the load-bearing elements were in almost the right positions, and the whole thing had the particular uncanny quality of something that looked like familiar logic, but didn't quite function as it. Writing around something instead of inside it, she returned to Devin's office and sat down. "I need you to answer a question honestly," she said. Devin nodded. If I told you that the compositional approach in that demo was developed by me over the course of my work from 2017 to now, and that I have registration documentation for every element of that development, and that the approach in that demo is derivative of a documented system that I own, what would your response be? Devin Strand was 52 years old and had been in this industry for 30 of those years. He had heard variations of this conversation before. What he had not heard, usually, was someone deliver it with this level of precision and calm, with the implicit weight of registration documentation sitting in the sentence like a structural beam. He was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said, "My response would be that this is a legal matter, and I would want to see the documentation." "Good," Lena said. "So would I." Dr. Felicia Osei had, over the past 2 years of occasional consultation, would become someone Lena thought of as an advisor in the truest sense. Someone whose job was to see the situation clearly, without the distortion of emotional investment, and to tell you what you were actually working with. She had the quality of perfect intellectual honesty that made her occasionally uncomfortable to consult with, because she would not tell you what you wanted to hear. She would only tell you what was true. Lena sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon and laid out the situation in full. She walked through the history of the compositions, the registration timeline, the specific elements of the harmonic system she had documented in her copyright filings. She walked through the cartography history. The first life she did not include, obviously, but she had the paper trail of her own work, which predated cartography chronologically and was documented in her registration records, and she explained what she believed had been taken and when. Then she played Dr. Osei the demo. Dr. Osei listened with her hands folded and her face still. When it ended, she said, "Tell me about the registration timing on the harmonic system documentation." Lena took out her master document. Every filing, every date, every registration number. Dr. Osei went through it methodically, her pen moving in small marks across a legal pad. Oh, the kind of notation that was her own system, and that Lena had never tried to decode. After 20 minutes, Dr. Osei looked up. The compositional copyright filings predate the cartography release by 11 months for the earliest compositions, and the system-level documentation predates the demo in question by approximately 3 years. She paused. This is a defensible claim. Under what theory? Lena asked, because she wanted to understand it completely. Well, copyright in musical composition protects not just the specific notes, but the structural elements, the harmonic language, the specific progression logic, the compositional architecture. When those elements are sufficiently original and are documented as the product of a specific author. Your filings are unusually thorough. She looked at the documentation again. Most artists don't register at this level of granularity, but you've essentially registered not just individual songs, but the methodology. That's unusual. I had guidance, Lena said, meaning the music copyright book with its dog-eared pages, meaning Raymond's early instruction about the container, meaning the 7 years she had spent watching what happened when the container didn't exist. The cartography situation is more complicated, Dr. Osei said, because those registrations predate your formal copyright filings. You were writing the material, but you weren't registering it contemporaneously. I know. The demo is different. For the demo, the timeline is clean. Your system is documented before their application of it. She set down her pen. I want to bring in Marcus Webb on this. He's had recent experience with musical system copyright claims. He'll have a sharper view on what a filing looks like. Marcus Webb. Lena knew the name from her reading. He had been involved in 2 high-profile music copyright cases in the past 3 years, both of which had settled in favor of the plaintiff, both of which involved the kind of systematic compositional appropriation rather than direct melodic copying. She had read the settlement terms in trade publications and understood, from reading them carefully, that the distinction between melodic plagiarism and architectural appropriation was a relatively new area of copyright law, one that was being developed case by case, and that currently sat in the productive ambiguity where the law had not fully caught up to the reality of how music was being made and remade. Set up a meeting, Lena said. That Marcus Webb was 44 and had the specific quality of stillness that Lena associated with people who had spent years in rooms where the carefully chosen word was the only reliable tool. He was not warm in the way Raymond was warm. He was precise in the way that a good instrument is precise, in the way that you could rely on the consistency of its output. He read through the documentation she had prepared, which was organized chronologically and cross-referenced by compositional element, without speaking for 40 minutes. When he looked up, he said, "You anticipated this?" "I anticipated something," she said. "This level of documentation, the granularity of the registrations. Most artists don't think this way. Who taught you to think this way?" "I taught myself," she said. After I understood what it cost not to." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "Here's the technical position. Musical composition copyright has traditionally protected melody, harmony, and rhythm as expressed in a specific work. Maybe recent case law has been expanding the scope of what qualifies as protectable expression in compositional architecture. The systematic structure of harmonic language when that structure is demonstrably original and documented. Your registrations are filing at this level. You're not saying she used my chords, you're saying she used the structural logic of a harmonic system I developed and documented." Yes, Lena said. Mein Kummo, the challenge is that system-level copyright in music is not settled law. There are arguments on both sides. The strength of your position depends on the clarity of your documentation and the degree to which the defendant's work is specifically derivative of the system rather than merely similar in style. I can demonstrate specific elements, not just general similarity. Then we have a conversation worth having. This was not a declaration of certainty. Oh, Marcus Webb was not a person who made declarations of certainty, but the conversation worth having was, Lena understood, the only opening she had ever needed. She asked, "What does the filing look like?" "It's not a filing, initially. It's a notice. We send Carver Strand's legal team a formal notice of claim, documenting the prior copyright registrations, identifying the specific elements in question in the demo, and requesting a meeting to discuss. The notice is not a lawsuit. Also, it's a formal declaration of position. It gives the other party the opportunity to respond before anything becomes public. And if they respond with denial, then we escalate. But denial is an interesting choice when the documentation is this clean." He looked at the master document again. "If I were their attorney, I would not advise denial. I would advise a very careful conversation about how the demo came to exist and who was present during its development. Vivian, in the room when the demo came to exist. Vivian, who had been meeting with the Carver Strand A&R team for 8 months trying to find a direction for the second record. Vivienne, who had been listening to Lena's work for 3 years, attending her salon evenings, sitting across from her at dinners, asking questions about influences and harmonic sources with the attentive specificity of someone who was not only listening. "Send the notice," Lena said. The response came in 12 days. From a partner at the law firm that represented both Vivian personally and Carver Strand's artist roster. It was a letter of 3 pages, professionally written and carefully phrased, which said in legal language that Vivian Park's compositional approach was entirely her own, that any similarities to the documented system of Lena Cho were the natural result of 2 artists working in a shared contemporary sonic landscape, and that the copyright registrations in question were being reviewed. Out it was in Marcus Webb's assessment, a stalling response. It neither denied nor conceded. It bought time. "They're reviewing the registrations," he said, "because they're trying to find the technical argument. They want to find a hole in the documentation that creates reasonable doubt about the timeline." "There isn't one," Lena said. "I know, which means they'll come back to the table eventually." While they waited, Lena did something she had been planning for months, something that operated on an entirely different layer from the legal situation, something that the legal situation was not even the primary engine of. She gave an interview, not to a music press journalist, to Dr. Emile Fontaine, who's a musicologist at the university who had been following the development of low-frequency architecture with academic interest and who wanted to publish a formal analysis of the compositional methodology in a music theory journal. The interview was technical. Dr. Fontaine asked about the specific harmonic principles, the development of the low-frequency architecture approach, the compositional influences she was working through and against. Lena answered with the same methodical clarity she had brought to everything in this timeline, not performing depth, but actually going to the depth, laying it out in terms that were specific and technical and, crucially, dated. The interview itself would become a public document with a publication date in a peer-reviewed journal that described the compositional system in exact terms and attributed it to a specific author. It was, Marcus told her when she described the plan, an elegant piece of documentation. The legal filings established prior existence. The published analysis established prior understanding. The intellectual framework had been publicly explained before the legal claim was made, which created a record that was immune to the argument that the framing had been constructed after the fact to fit the claim. She did not feel like she was being clever. She felt like she was doing what should have been done from the beginning, treating her own work with the seriousness it deserved, building around it the infrastructure that the work itself required. This was not retaliation. This was simply the correct way to exist as an author. The second letter came 6 weeks after the first. This one was 4 pages and was from a different partner at the same firm, a more senior partner, which Marcus noted with quiet satisfaction. Oh, the tone had shifted from the formal distance of the first letter to something more procedural, more careful. It requested a meeting. The meeting was held in the conference room of the law firm, on a floor that had a view of the city, in a direction that Lena did not normally see it from. The light coming in at a western angle that made the buildings outside look briefly like they were made of something amber and warm. There were 4 people on the other side: the senior partner, a junior associate taking notes, and Devon Strand's general counsel. Devon himself was not there. Vivienne was not there either. This was, Marcus had explained, strategic on their end. Keeping Vivienne absent from the meeting meant that anything discussed could not be attributed to admissions made by the artist directly. It also, however, meant that whatever the legal team said in that room was being said without the artist's perspective tempering it, which sometimes made things simpler. Honors, the senior partner, said after the preliminary positions had been exchanged, "We'd like to understand what resolution looks like from your client's perspective." Marcus looked at Lena. She had prepared for this question. "Attribution and compensation," she said. "On the demo in question and any related material that is demonstrably derived from my documented compositional system, I want formal acknowledgement of derivation and appropriate licensing terms. I want this documented in writing. Also with payment structured according to standard publishing rates for derivative works. Going forward, any use of the compositional methodology I've documented requires a negotiated license through Tungsten Music." The senior partner made a note. "And the cartography situation?" The room held still. This was the question they had known would come. The shadow of the first life, the older theft, the one that did not have the same clean documentation. Marcus had advised her on this carefully. But the cartography documentation was weaker. It was not without substance, but the timeline was messier, the registrations less contemporaneous. A legal claim there was possible, but risked. "The cartography situation," Lena said, "is separate from the current claim. I'm prepared to discuss it as a separate matter in a separate meeting with separate documentation." This was a choice she had made deliberately. She was not dropping cartography. She was not pretending it didn't exist. And she was keeping it in a box that she controlled the opening of. The current claim was clean and winnable. The cartography claim was more complicated, and she was not going to dilute the clean claim by bundling it with the complicated one. The senior partner looked at her. He was the kind of attorney who had seen every variation of the creative property dispute, who had learned to read the difference between someone who was angry and someone who had done the work. She watched him read her correctly. "We'll need time to consult with our client," he said. "Of course," Marcus said. "We'll follow up at end of week." Outside the building, on the sidewalk where the amber afternoon light was turning the concrete to something almost golden, Marcus put his hands in his coat pockets and said, "That went as well as it could have?" "I know," Lena said. "The separate meeting on cartography, that's not going away." "I don't want it to go away," she said. I just want it to go in the right order." The settlement on the demo, the current claim, resolved in 6 weeks. It was what the industry called a licensing settlement, which meant that Carver Strand and Vivienne's publishing entity formally acknowledged that the composition in the demo was derivative of a documented compositional system owned by Tungsten Music, and agreed to pay licensing fees structured according to standard publishing rates. A house with retroactive application to any prior use of similar methodology that could be demonstrated. The settlement was not public, but settlements in small industries were never truly private. The cartography meeting was different in character. Marcus had spent 3 weeks building the documentation for it. Not the original compositions, which were the harder problem, but the specific elements he could trace from the registration records Lena had made in this timeline. She had registered the compositions in her early 24-year-old months with the Copyright Office, but those registrations post-dated cartography's release. They were recorded evidence of what she had written, but they were filed after the album had already been released. The timeline problem was real. What Marcus found in the documentation she had built over 2 years in this timeline, was something that the first meeting's attorneys had apparently not looked closely enough to see. The musical system analysis, published in Dr. Fontaine's journal article, which cited specific harmonic elements of Lena's compositional approach as developed from 2017 through the present period. The journal article was academic and therefore dated by peer-review timeline. And in the supporting documentation of that article, in the appendix that Dr. Emma Fontaine had included to establish the compositional framework, were harmonic analyses of early demo recordings that Dr. Fontaine had been given access to, recordings that were time-stamped, registered, and presented in the article as evidence of methodological development. The demo recordings in the article's appendix included material that predated the cartography release. Marcus had read the appendix at 11:30 on a Tuesday night and called her at 11:45. "You knew this was in the article," he said. "I knew what I gave Dr. Fontaine," she said. "You gave him early demos as examples of your development process." "I gave him my development process." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The early demos in the article's appendix, are they registered?" "Everything I gave him was registered before I gave it to him," she said. The quiet was longer this time. "You've been building this for 2 years," he said. It was not a question. "Oh, I've been building my career for 2 years," she said. "The documentation is what happens when you take your work seriously." The cartography settlement took 4 months and involved, in addition to the attorneys, Raymond, who was brought into a conversation that he had not sought and that, she could see, moved through him like a seismic event. Raymond, who had loved Vivian as a daughter figure, so who had made an error of trust years ago that he had not fully understood as an error until it was laid before him, with the specificity of legal documentation, sat in a meeting that was designed to be a settlement negotiation and arrived at a particular kind of understanding that nothing in his career had prepared him for. He called Lena afterward. He did not say anything for almost 10 seconds after she picked up. Then he said, "I should have asked better questions." "You trusted," she said. "Oh, I understand that." "I should have—" "Raymond," she waited. "What's done is done. What matters now is what's documented." The cartography settlement was larger than the demo settlement. It was also not public. It included formal attribution acknowledgement in Vivian's catalog and a licensing agreement for the use of the compositional methodology that generated publishing income for Tungsten Music going forward. It did not include an apology, which Lena had not requested. Because an apology was not a legal or financial instrument, and therefore was not a thing the settlement could reliably produce. She didn't need it. Low-frequency architecture was, by the time the settlements concluded, into its 3rd year of slow accumulation. The sync placements had continued. 3 more, including one in a long-form documentary about urban infrastructure that was an almost comically literal pairing with the title, Nisha, which Lana had found darkly funny when it was proposed and accepted immediately. The publishing income, through Tungsten Music, had compounded in the way that properly structured music publishing income compounds when the underlying work continues to be placed and the registration is clean. Slowly, consistently, without the dramatic peaks and valleys of streaming revenue, building into something that was not spectacular on any given quarter and was, over time, substantial. Devonstrand had offered her a second record deal, with terms that included a higher advance and no discussion of the publishing structure because that conversation was clearly over. She had said she would think about it. She was thinking about it. On a Tuesday in November, 3 years and 2 months after she had woken up in the apartment with the off-white ceiling, she met Raymond for coffee. He was 66 now, with more gray and what had always been mostly gray. And he moved with the particular economy of motion that was either tiredness or the long-practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything precisely and without waste. He told her he had a new student he wanted her to meet. 19 years old, a pianist from Seoul with an approach to harmony that Raymond described as genuinely alien, in the best possible sense. She's doing something I don't yet have the vocabulary to explain. He told her the student's name was Yuna. Now, he told her she was shy and brilliant and terrified of her own work, in the specific way that some very talented people were terrified, not of failure, but of the exposure of being seen accurately. Lena thought of herself at 19. She thought of herself at 24, playing unfinished compositions for someone with large, warm eyes and a laugh that made you feel chosen. "Bring her by my studio," Lena said. I want to hear what she's doing." Raymond looked at her with an expression she recognized now, after years of watching it, as a very specific kind of relief. The relief of a teacher watching something he had planted years ago finally come in fully to flower. "I will," he said. She needs someone to tell her to love the container. I know, Lena said. So does everyone. She paid for the coffee. Outside, the November morning was doing what November mornings did. Cold at the edges. With a light that made everything look like it was made of something that wouldn't last. She walked home with her hands in her pockets, and the fourth movement of the second record moving through her head, the one she had been working on for 3 weeks and had not yet shown anyone. The one that began in a frequency so low, it was almost below hearing and built over 12 minutes. Let's listen to something that required the listener to have been present for all 12 minutes to understand why the final note landed where it did. She walked past the coffee shop with the exposed brick and the rotating local art. She did not go in. She was not interested in what was playing on the speakers.